Sometimes life forces us into paths of silence to prepare us for a greater destiny. In that conservative house, I was invisible to everyone except the truth that burned in my heart. Hello, my dear ones. I'm Eleanor, and today I'm 89 years old with a heart full of stories to tell. Before I begin this story that completely changed my life, I want to ask you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It's a joy to know that my stories reach so many different places. Today I'm going to tell you how I broke 70 years of silence to reveal a secret that shook the entire city of Salem, Oregon. This story begins on a rainy Tuesday in March 1954, when I was just 19 years old and thought I knew what love was. I had no idea that the next 18 months would test every fiber of my being and force me to make choices that would haunt me for 7 decades. But sometimes, my dears, the biggest revelations come when we least expect them, and the courage to speak the truth arrives just when we think it's too late. It was during my 89th birthday celebration last October when everything changed. My family had gathered in the old Victorian house on State Street, the same house where I'd lived most of my married life. The afternoon sun was streaming through the lace curtains my late husband had chosen 40 years ago, casting shadows that seemed to dance with memories I'd buried so deep I sometimes forgot they existed. My grandchildren were laughing around the dining table, and my great-grandchildren were playing in the garden where I used to hide my diary as a young woman. Bobby, who everyone believed was my younger brother, was helping serve the birthday cake when my granddaughter Sarah picked up an old photograph from the mantelpiece. "Grandma Ellie," she said, "tell us about your wedding day. You look so serious in this picture." I stared at that photograph, taken in June 1954, and felt something crack inside my chest. The woman in white wasn't me, not really. She was a carefully constructed lie, a performance I'd been giving for 70 years. I looked around at these beautiful faces, these people I loved more than life itself, and realized that if I died tomorrow, they would never know who I really was. The weight of that realization was suffocating. That wasn't my real wedding day, I heard myself say, and the room fell completely silent. The confession tumbled out like water through a broken dam. I told them about my father, Colonel William Thompson, the most respected man in Salem's conservative society. I told them about Harold Pemberton, the wealthy businessman who was 45 years old and had been rejected by 3 other families because of his terrible reputation. I told them how my father announced on that rainy Tuesday in March that I would marry Harold in June, with no discussion, no choice, no consideration for what I might want. "But Grandma," my grandson Michael interrupted, "didn't you love Grandpa Harold?" The question pierced my heart because Harold had been a good man, eventually. Not the man I was supposed to marry originally, but the second choice, the emergency selection, after everything fell apart. "No, sweetheart," I whispered. I was in love with someone else entirely. His name was James Mitchell, and he was the most beautiful soul I'd ever encountered. I watched their faces change as I described Jimmy, 23 years old with gentle hands and eyes that saw straight through to my heart. He taught at the local elementary school, came from a poor family, and wrote poetry that made me believe in magic. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I would find excuses to walk past the school, just to catch a glimpse of him. When he finally spoke to me at the church social in February, I knew my life had changed forever. The secret meetings began immediately after that first conversation. Jimmy would wait for me behind the old oak tree near Riverfront Park, and we would walk along the Willamette River talking about books and dreams and the life we wanted to build together. He told me about his plans to save money for a little house with a garden where I could grow roses. I told him about my dreams of traveling beyond Salem, maybe even to California or New York. We were young and foolish and completely, utterly in love. When my father announced the engagement to Harold Pemberton, I felt like my world was ending. That night, I snuck out of the house and ran to Jimmy's boarding room near the school. I was sobbing so hard I could barely speak, but he held me and promised we would find a way. "We'll leave," he whispered into my hair. "We'll go somewhere they can't find us and start over." It seemed impossible, but love makes you believe in impossible things. We began planning our escape immediately. Jimmy had a cousin in Portland who could help us get married quietly, and we started saving every penny we could find. I sold my grandmother's jewelry piece by piece, telling my mother I'd lost them. Jimmy took on extra tutoring work in the evenings. We were going to leave the night before my wedding to Harold, disappear into the darkness like characters in one of the romantic novels I read in secret. But Salem was a small town, and secrets had a way of revealing themselves. 3 weeks before the wedding, Father O'Malley approached me after Sunday service. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "I know about you and young Mr. Mitchell." My blood turned to ice, but instead of threatening to tell my father, the priest surprised me. "I've been watching that boy for 2 years," he continued. "He's got a good heart and a pure soul. What your father is planning isn't right." Father O'Malley offered to help us, but he wanted us to wait until after harvest season, when our disappearance wouldn't be noticed immediately. "Give me until September," he pleaded. "Let me try to reason with your father first." But we were too impatient, too desperate, too in love to wait. Looking back now, I realized that if we had listened to Father O'Malley, everything might have turned out differently. Instead, we decided to stick to our original plan. The night before my wedding to Harold Pemberton, I packed a small bag and climbed out of my bedroom window for the last time. Jimmy was waiting in his borrowed car, and we drove through the darkness toward what we thought was freedom. We made it to his aunt's house in Mill City, just 30 miles away, where she agreed to hide us until we could figure out our next step. For 3 months, we lived like husband and wife in that tiny attic room, and they were the happiest months of my entire life. Those 3 months felt like a beautiful dream that I never wanted to wake up from. Jimmy found work at the local mill, and I helped his aunt with her sewing business. We lived simply, but we were together, and that was all that mattered. Every morning I would wake up next to the man I loved and feel grateful for each stolen day. We talked about getting married properly, maybe moving to California where nobody knew our story. Jimmy wrote letters to his cousin in Los Angeles, asking about work opportunities. I practiced signing my name as Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell in the margins of old newspapers. We felt safe, hidden away from the world that wanted to control our fate. But in late August, I began feeling terribly sick in the mornings. At first, I thought it was just the stress of our situation, but when the nausea continued for 2 weeks, Jimmy's aunt pulled me aside for a gentle conversation. "Child," she said, "I think you might be carrying a baby." The news should have filled me with joy, and part of me was thrilled at the thought of having Jimmy's child. But I was also terrified because I knew our secret couldn't stay hidden much longer. A baby would make everything more complicated, more dangerous. When I told Jimmy, he held me close and promised that nothing would change. "We'll be a family," he said. "A real family." But fate had other plans for us. Someone in Mill City recognized me and sent word back to Salem. On a cold September morning, I woke up to the sound of car doors slamming outside the house. Through the attic window, I saw my father with 3 other men walking toward the front door. My heart stopped. Jimmy tried to hide me, but there was nowhere to go. When my father climbed those narrow stairs and saw us together, his face turned a color I'd never seen before. "You have disgraced our family for the last time," he said, his voice deadly quiet. But Jimmy, my brave, foolish Jimmy, stepped in front of me. "Mr. Thompson," he said, "I love your daughter, and she loves me. We want to get married and build a life together." I had never seen anyone stand up to my father like that, and for a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, he would listen. Instead, my father's face grew darker. "You think you can steal my daughter and get away with it?" he shouted. "You think a poor schoolteacher is worthy of a Thompson?" The argument escalated quickly, with Jimmy defending our love and my father threatening to have him arrested for kidnapping. I watched these two men fighting over my future, as if I had no voice in the matter. Then, suddenly, my father clutched his chest and collapsed. The heart attack was massive and immediate. He died right there on the floor of that tiny attic room, with his eyes fixed on my face. I blamed myself completely. The guilt nearly destroyed me. My father's funeral was the largest Salem had seen in decades, and I stood at his graveside knowing that I had killed him with my disobedience. My mother was inconsolable, and my younger sister Rebecca looked at me with such disappointment that I wanted to disappear forever. The whole town was talking about the scandal, about how Colonel Thompson's wild daughter had brought shame to the family name and caused his death. Jimmy tried to comfort me, but I couldn't bear to look at him without remembering my father's face in those final moments. 2 days after the funeral, my uncle arrived with a sheriff's deputy and took me home. They told Jimmy that if he ever came near me again, they would have him arrested. I was essentially a prisoner in my own house, with my mother and aunt watching my every move. But the worst part was the secret growing inside me. By October, I couldn't hide my pregnancy anymore. And when my mother discovered the truth, she made a decision that would define the rest of my life. "We will tell everyone that your cousin Margaret died in childbirth and left us her baby to raise," she announced. "The child will be your brother, not your son. No one can ever know the truth." I was 19 years old, pregnant, and completely powerless to fight back. The lie became our family's new reality. My son was born on a snowy February morning in 1955, and they immediately took him from my arms and handed him to my mother. "This is your baby brother, Robert," she told my sister Rebecca, who was only 16 and too confused to ask questions. I was forced to call my own child Bobby and pretend to be his older sister for the rest of his childhood. Can you imagine the torture of watching your son grow up believing someone else was his mother? Of celebrating Mother's Day, knowing that you could never claim the most important title of your life? I would sneak into his room at night just to watch him sleep, memorizing his face and whispering all the lullabies I could never sing to him during the day. My mother found me a husband within 6 months, a quiet widower named Joseph Thompson, who needed a wife and didn't ask too many questions about my family's recent troubles. Joseph was kind but distant, and our marriage was more of a business arrangement than a love story. I gave him 3 children over the next 8 years, and he gave me respectability and a home where Bobby could grow up safely. But every day I carried the weight of my secrets, and every night I wrote letters to Jimmy in a diary I hid behind the loose floorboard in my closet. I wrote to him about Bobby's first words, his first steps, his first day of school. I told him about the man our son was becoming, about his gentle nature and his love of books. Jimmy never knew he had a child, and Bobby never knew who his real mother was. The years passed slowly, each one adding another layer to the lies we were living. Bobby grew up believing he was the youngest Thompson child, the surprise baby who came along when his sister Eleanor was already 19. He called me Ellie and saved his hugs for our mother, who died when he was 12 years old. After her funeral, I thought about telling him the truth, but I was too afraid of what it might do to him. He was just a boy, and he'd already lost the only mother he'd ever known. How could I tell him that his entire life was built on a lie? So I continued the charade, being the protective older sister instead of the loving mother my heart desperately wanted to be. I helped him with his homework, attended his school plays, and cheered at his baseball games, all while pretending that the fierce love I felt for him was just sisterly affection. When he graduated from high school and left for college, I cried for 3 days straight. Joseph thought I was just emotional about my little brother leaving home, but I was mourning all the moments I'd missed, all the conversations we'd never had, All the times I'd bitten my tongue instead of giving him the guidance only a mother can provide. Bobby became a teacher just like his father, though he never knew that connection. He married a lovely girl named Susan and gave me grandchildren who called me Aunt Ellie. I spoiled those babies terribly, pouring all my suppressed maternal love into every visit and birthday present. For 70 years, I lived with the weight of these secrets, watching Bobby build his life without ever knowing the truth about where he came from. I attended his wedding, celebrated his children's births, and comforted him when Susan passed away 5 years ago. Through it all, I was dying a little more each day, knowing that I was living a lie so profound it had shaped every relationship in my family. When my great-granddaughter asked about that wedding photograph, something inside me finally broke. I looked at Bobby, now 69 years old with silver hair and lines around his eyes that reminded me so much of Jimmy, and I realized that if I died with this secret, I would be cheating all of us out of the truth we deserved. "Bobby," I said, my voice shaking, "you're not my brother. You're my son." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched his face go through every emotion possible: confusion, disbelief, anger, hurt. "That's impossible," he whispered. But even as he said it, I could see him remembering things, connecting dots that had never made sense before. Why I had always been so protective of him. Why I knew things about his preferences that even our mother hadn't known. Why I had cried so hard when he moved away for college. The family gathering turned into a crisis as everyone tried to process what I'd just revealed. Some of them were angry that I'd lied for so long. Others were amazed by the sacrifice I'd made. But Bobby just sat there, staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time. The revelation sent shockwaves through not just our family, but the entire Salem community. Word spread quickly through the church, the grocery store, the coffee shops where longtime residents gathered to share gossip. Some people were scandalized that I'd kept such a massive secret for 70 years. Others were sympathetic, understanding the impossible position I'd been put in as a 19-year-old girl. The younger women in town, especially those who had grown up with more choices than my generation ever had, were amazed by the strength it must have taken to carry such a burden for so long. But the person whose reaction mattered most to me was Bobby himself. For weeks after my confession, he barely spoke to me. He would come to Sunday dinner but sit quietly, studying my face like he was trying to reconcile the sister he'd known with the mother I actually was. Susan's sister Martha told me he was going through old family photographs, looking for clues he might have missed. He drove to Mill City and found the house where Jimmy and I had hidden all those years ago, though the aunt who helped us had long since passed away. Finally, one evening in November, Bobby knocked on my door with a box in his hands. "I found these in Mother's attic after she died," he said, referring to the woman we'd both called our mother. "I never understood why she kept them, but now I think they might belong to you." Inside the box were letters that Jimmy had written to me after my father took me away. Letters that had been intercepted and hidden for 70 years. Reading Jimmy's letters was like opening a time capsule to the deepest love I'd ever known. He had written to me every week for 2 years after we were separated, begging me to contact him, telling me how much he missed me, asking if I was safe and happy. He never knew about Bobby. Never knew that I was carrying his child when my father found us. In his final letter, dated December 1956, he told me that he was moving to California to start over, but that he would love me until his dying day. He had died in a car accident in 1958, just 4 years after we were separated, never knowing that he had a son. Bobby and I read those letters together, and for the first time in 70 years, I told him everything about his father. I described Jimmy's gentle hands, his love of poetry, his dreams of traveling the world, his kindness to every student who walked into his classroom. I told Bobby about the 3 months when we lived as a family, about how excited Jimmy had been when we discovered I was pregnant, about how he had promised to be the best father in the world. As I shared these memories, I watched Bobby's face transform. He wasn't just learning about his biological father. He was learning about himself, understanding where his love of teaching had come from, why he had always felt drawn to poetry and literature, why he had the same gentle nature that I remembered so clearly in Jimmy. For the first time since my confession, Bobby reached over and hugged me, not as a brother hugging his sister, but as a son embracing his mother. The healing process wasn't immediate or easy, but it was real. Bobby and I began having long conversations about the past, about the choices I'd made, and the life he'd lived not knowing the truth. He was angry sometimes, hurt that I'd kept him from knowing his real father, frustrated that we'd lost so many years of having an honest relationship. But he was also amazed by the sacrifice I'd made, keeping him safe and giving him a stable childhood, even though it meant denying my own role as his mother. We started new traditions, like Sunday morning coffee, where he would ask me questions about Jimmy, and I would share every memory I could recall. I gave him Jimmy's poetry, which I'd kept hidden in my diary all these years, and watched him cry as he read words his father had written about love and hope and the future he'd dreamed of having. Bobby began researching Jimmy's family and discovered that he had cousins still living in California who remembered stories about the young teacher who had fallen in love with a colonel's daughter back in Oregon. Some of Bobby's children struggled with the revelation at first, confused about how to relate to me, now that they knew I was actually their grandmother instead of their great-aunt. But love has a way of adapting to truth, and gradually our family found a new dynamic that honored both the years we'd spent together under false pretenses and the authentic relationships we were building now. My great-granddaughter Sarah, the one who had asked about the wedding photograph, told me that my story had inspired her to be more honest about her own dreams and not let anyone pressure her into choices that didn't feel right. As word of my confession spread through Salem, something unexpected began to happen. Women started reaching out to me, sharing their own stories of forced marriages, family secrets, and choices they'd made under pressure from society or family expectations. My living room became an informal gathering place where wives and mothers would come to talk about their struggles, their regrets, and their hopes for the future. Some of these women were my age, carrying their own decades-old secrets. Others were young mothers trying to navigate the balance between family expectations and personal happiness. I realized that my story, as painful as it had been to live through, was giving other people permission to examine their own lives and make changes where needed. The conservative community that had once forced me into silence was slowly beginning to have conversations about women's choices, about the price of keeping secrets, about the courage it takes to live authentically. Not everyone approved, of course. Some longtime residents thought I should have taken my secrets to the grave, that airing such personal family business was inappropriate and selfish. But more and more people began to see my confession not as a betrayal of family privacy, but as a brave act that had freed not just me, but others who felt trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Bobby became my strongest supporter, telling anyone who would listen that he was proud to finally know the truth about his parentage and grateful for the mother who had loved him enough to sacrifice everything for his well-being. Now, at 89 years old, I wake up every morning feeling lighter than I have in 70 years. The house that once felt filled with shadows and secrets now welcomes sunshine and honest conversation. Bobby visits almost every day, sometimes bringing his children and grandchildren to hear more stories about their grandfather Jimmy. We've created a memory book filled with Jimmy's letters, his poetry, and stories about our brief time together, so that future generations will know where they came from and understand the love story that brought them into existence. I've also written down everything I can remember about those days, in 1954 and 1955, not just for my family, but for historians who are documenting women's experiences in the 1950s. Salem Historical Society has asked if they can include my story in their collection of oral histories, and I've agreed because I think it's important for young people to understand how different life was for women of my generation, and how much courage it took to make choices that went against society's expectations. The regrets I carry are real and deep. I wish I could have told Bobby the truth when he was younger. I wish I could have contacted Jimmy before he died. I wish I could have been braver sooner. But I've learned that regret can coexist with gratitude. And I'm grateful for every day I get to spend as Bobby's acknowledged mother, as a great-grandmother who can speak freely about love and loss, as a woman who finally found the courage to live in truth rather than comfortable lies. My confession last October changed everything, not just for me and my family, but for our entire community. Salem is still a conservative town in many ways, but there's a new openness to discussing difficult topics, a recognition that keeping secrets often causes more harm than revealing truth. 3 young women have postponed weddings to men they weren't sure about, saying that my story made them realize they deserved to marry for love rather than family expectations. An elderly man came forward with his own secret about a child he'd fathered decades ago and never acknowledged. The ripple effects of truth-telling continue to spread through our community in ways I never anticipated. But the most precious change is in my relationship with Bobby, who now calls me Mom when we're alone together, and Ellie in public, honoring both the sister I pretended to be and the mother I always was. We've talked about changing the family records to reflect the truth, but ultimately decided that what matters most is not what the documents say, but how we treat each other moving forward. Jimmy's grandson visited us last month, having heard our story through his family network in California. He brought photographs of Jimmy as a young man, and Bobby was amazed by how much they resembled each other. We spent an afternoon sharing stories, and for the first time since 1954, I felt like Jimmy's spirit was present with us, watching his son and grandson getting to know each other across the decades. The love story that began in a small Oregon town 70 years ago finally had witnesses who could honor it properly. Fim da Historia. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end. I hope my story has touched your heart. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like on the video. It helps us tremendously. Every day we bring new emotional stories about life, so feel free to explore and find your favorite. And of course, we want to know your opinion. What did you think of this story? Tell us in the comments. See you tomorrow with another incredible story. Tentar novamente. A história está curta demais. Faça o correto editar. Expandiu história para atender requisitos de caracteres. 4. É só o usuário está correto. Preciso verificar o número de caracteres da história que escrevi. As instruções são muito claras. A história deve ter exatamente entre 55.000 e 60.000 caracteres, dividida em 10 capítulos. Cada capítulo deve ter entre 5.500 e 6.000 caracteres. Vou contar os caracteres da história que escrevi. Parece que está bem mais curta do que deveria. Preciso reescrever completamente, fazendo uma história muito mais longa e detalhada, seguindo exatamente as especificações de caracteres. Vou criar uma versão muito mais expandida, com diálogos mais extensos, descrições mais detalhadas e desenvolvimento mais profundo de cada capítulo para atingir o limite correto de caracteres. Você está absolutamente correto. Vou reescrever a história completa com o número correto de caracteres. Aqui está a versão completa. Sometimes life forces us into paths of silence to prepare us for a greater destiny. In that conservative house, I was invisible to everyone, except the truth that burned in my heart like a secret flame that refused to be extinguished. Hello, my dear ones. I'm Eleanor Margaret Thompson, and today I'm 89 years old, with a heart full of stories that I've carried in silence for 7 decades. Before I begin this story that completely changed not just my life, but the lives of everyone I love, I want to ask you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It's such a joy to know that my stories reach so many different places around this beautiful world. Today I'm going to tell you how I broke 70 years of silence to reveal a secret that shook the entire city of Salem, Oregon, and how one moment of courage changed everything I thought I knew about family, love, and the price of living a lie. This story begins on a rainy Tuesday morning in March 1954, when I was just 19 years old and thought I understood what love meant. I had no idea that the next 18 months would test every fiber of my being, force me to make impossible choices, and create a web of secrets so complex that it would take me 7 decades to find the courage to unravel it. But sometimes, my precious listeners, the biggest revelations come when we least expect them, and the strength to speak our truth arrives just when we think it's too late to make any difference at all. It was during my 89th birthday celebration this past October when everything in my carefully constructed world came crashing down like a house of cards in a windstorm. My family had gathered in the old Victorian house on State Street, the same house where I'd lived most of my married life, where I'd raised children who weren't really my siblings, where I'd kept secrets so deep that sometimes I forgot where the lies ended and the truth began. The afternoon sun was streaming through the delicate lace curtains that my late husband Joseph had chosen 40 years ago, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with memories I'd buried so deep, I sometimes convinced myself they'd never really happened at all. My grandchildren were laughing and chattering around the polished mahogany dining table, their voices mixing with the sound of silverware against china and the gentle hum of conversation that fills a house when family comes together. My great-grandchildren were playing in the garden where I used to hide my diary as a young woman, their innocent laughter drifting through the open windows like music from another lifetime. Bobby, the man everyone in that room believed was my younger brother, was helping my daughter-in-law serve the birthday cake, his silver hair catching the light as he moved with the same gentle grace I remembered from his father, though he'd never known that connection existed. My granddaughter, Sarah, a beautiful girl of 22, with eyes full of curiosity about the world, picked up an old photograph from the mantelpiece, a formal wedding portrait that had sat in the same spot for decades. "Grandma Ellie," she said, her voice carrying across the room with the innocent enthusiasm of youth. "Tell us about your wedding day. You look so serious in this picture, almost sad. Weren't you happy?" I stared at that photograph, taken in June 1955, and felt something crack deep inside my chest, like ice breaking on a frozen pond. The woman in white in that photograph wasn't really me, not in any way that mattered. She was a carefully constructed performance, a lie wrapped in silk and lace, a young woman who had already buried her heart and was simply going through the motions of what everyone expected her to do. I looked around at these beautiful faces surrounding me, these people I loved more than life itself, and realized with stunning clarity that if I died tomorrow, they would never know who I really was, underneath all the stories we'd been telling ourselves for 7 decades. The weight of that realization was absolutely suffocating, pressing down on my chest like a physical force that made it hard to breathe. That wasn't my real wedding day, I heard myself say, the words tumbling out before I could stop them, and the room fell into a silence so complete I could hear the old grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. 22 pairs of eyes turned to stare at me, confusion and concern written across every face. "What do you mean, Grandma?" Sarah asked gently, setting the photograph back on the mantelpiece with trembling fingers. And that's when the dam burst completely. when 70 years of carefully guarded secrets came pouring out like water through a broken levee. I told them about my father, Colonel William Thompson, the most respected and feared man in Salem's conservative society, a man whose word was law and whose expectations were absolute. I told them about Harold Pemberton, the wealthy businessman who was 45 years old, had been rejected by 3 other prominent families because of his terrible reputation in business dealings, and who had been chosen by my father to be my husband without any consideration of what I might want or feel. I told them how my father had announced on that rainy Tuesday in March 1954 that I would marry Harold Pemberton in June, with no discussion, no negotiation, no acknowledgement that I might have thoughts or feelings about spending the rest of my life with a man I barely knew and certainly didn't love. But Grandma, my grandson Michael interrupted, his young voice full of confusion. Didn't you love Grandpa Harold eventually? You always seemed happy together. The question pierced straight through my heart, because Harold had indeed been a good man eventually, after we learned to build a life together based on mutual respect rather than passion. Not the man I was originally supposed to marry, but the second choice. The emergency selection after everything in my life fell apart like dominoes in a row. No, sweetheart, I whispered, my voice barely audible in the suddenly quiet room. I was desperately, completely, utterly in love with someone else entirely. His name was James Mitchell, and he was the most beautiful soul I had ever encountered in my 19 years on this earth. I watched their faces change as I began to describe Jimmy with all the love and longing that I'd kept locked away for 7 decades. He was 23 years old with gentle hands that had never known violence, eyes the color of summer sky that seemed to see straight through to the very center of my heart, and a smile that could light up the darkest room and make even the most ordinary moment feel like magic. He taught at Salem Elementary School, came from a poor but honest family that lived on the wrong side of the railroad tracks, and wrote poetry that made me believe in possibilities I'd never dared to imagine before I met him. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, I would find elaborate excuses to walk past the school, just to catch a glimpse of him helping students with their lessons or organizing books in the small library. When he finally gathered the courage to speak to me at the monthly church social in February 1954, standing awkwardly by the refreshment table with his hat in his hands, I knew immediately that my entire life had changed forever. "Miss Thompson," he had said, his voice soft and nervous, "I was wondering if you might like to take a walk sometime. Maybe talk about the books you're always carrying." That simple invitation opened the door to the most beautiful and tragic love story of my entire existence. The secret meetings began immediately after that first conversation, and every moment we spent together felt like stolen treasure that we had to guard with our lives. Jimmy would wait for me behind the massive old oak tree near Riverfront Park, always arriving 15 minutes early, because he said he couldn't bear the thought of keeping me waiting, even for a moment. We would walk slowly along the Willamette River, talking about everything and nothing, sharing dreams and fears and hopes for a future that seemed both impossible and inevitable at the same time. He told me about his plans to save every penny he could earn, so that someday he could buy a little house with a garden where I could grow the roses I'd always dreamed of tending. I told him about my secret desire to travel beyond the boundaries of Salem, maybe even to California or New York, places that seemed as exotic and unreachable as the moon itself. We were young and naive and completely, utterly, desperately in love with the kind of pure passion that only happens once in a lifetime, if you're lucky. When my father announced my engagement to Harold Pemberton at the dinner table that terrible March evening, his voice as cold and final as a judge pronouncing a death sentence, I felt like my entire world was collapsing around me. "You will marry Harold Pemberton in June," he declared, not looking up from his newspaper. The arrangements have been made. The invitations will be sent next week, and there will be no discussion about this matter. That night, after everyone in the house was asleep, I snuck out through my bedroom window and ran through the dark streets to Jimmy's boarding room near the school, my nightgown billowing behind me like the wings of a ghost. I was sobbing so hard I could barely speak when he opened the door, but he pulled me inside and held me while I told him about my father's pronouncement. "We'll leave," he whispered into my hair, his own voice shaking with emotion. "We'll go somewhere they can't find us and start over with nothing but each other." It seemed completely impossible, but love has a way of making even the most impossible dreams feel within reach. We began planning our escape immediately, meeting every day to work out the details of what felt like the most important military operation of our lives. Jimmy had a cousin in Portland who had written to say he could help us get married quietly, without any questions asked, and we started saving every penny we could find, hiding our small treasures in a coffee tin that we buried beneath the oak tree where we'd first kissed. I sold my grandmother's pearl earrings and gold bracelet piece by piece to different shops around town, telling my mother elaborate stories about how I'd lost them or left them at friends' houses. Jimmy took on extra tutoring work in the evenings, helping struggling students with their arithmetic and reading, working by candlelight until his eyes burned because we needed every cent we could gather. We were going to leave on the night before my scheduled wedding to Harold, disappearing into the darkness like characters in one of the romantic adventure novels I read in secret beneath my bedroom covers. The plan was simple and desperate, and filled with the kind of hope that only young lovers can sustain. We would take the late train to Portland, get married at his cousin's church, and then travel further west to California, where nobody knew our names or our story. For 3 months, we refined every detail, memorizing train schedules and saving money, and dreaming about the life we would build together, far away from Salem's suffocating expectations. We even chose names for the children we hoped to have someday, planning a future that seemed as bright and certain as the sunrise. But Salem was a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and secrets had a way of revealing themselves when you least expected it. 3 weeks before my scheduled wedding to Harold, as I was leaving Sunday service with my family, Father O'Malley approached me near the church steps. "Eleanor," he said quietly, his kind eyes full of concern, "I need to speak with you privately about a matter of great importance." My blood turned to ice water in my veins, but instead of threatening to expose our plan to my father, the elderly priest surprised me completely. "I know about you and young Mr. Mitchell," Father O'Malley continued, glancing around to make sure we couldn't be overheard by the other parishioners filing out of the church. "I've been watching that boy for 2 years now, and he's got the kind of good heart and pure soul that's becoming rare in this world. What your father is planning for you isn't right in the eyes of God or man." I stared at him in shock, unable to believe that someone in a position of authority was actually taking our side, instead of condemning us for daring to choose love over duty. Father O'Malley explained that he had known my father since they were boys together, and while he respected the colonel's position in the community, he couldn't stand by and watch an innocent young woman be forced into a loveless marriage for the sake of business arrangements and social status. "I want to help you both," he said, "but I need you to trust me and wait for the right moment." The priest offered to try reasoning with my father first, to appeal to whatever compassion might still exist in his heart after decades of military discipline and social climbing. "Give me until September," Father O'Malley pleaded, his weathered hands clasped together as if in prayer. "Let me see if I can change his mind, and if not, I'll help you escape in a way that won't bring the full force of his anger down on both of you." But we were too impatient, too desperate, too frightened that our window of opportunity would close forever if we waited even another month. Looking back now with the wisdom that only comes from living through 8 decades of consequences, I realize that if we had listened to Father O'Malley's counsel and waited for his help, everything in our lives might have turned out completely differently. Instead, we decided to stick to our original plan, driven by the kind of urgency that makes young hearts do reckless things. The night before my scheduled wedding to Harold Pemberton arrived like a storm that had been building on the horizon for months. I had barely slept for a week. My nerves stretched so tight, I jumped at every sound, every footstep in the hallway, every creak of the old house settling around us. My wedding dress hung in the wardrobe like a white ghost, a symbol of the life I was supposed to accept, but could never embrace. At 11 o'clock, when I was certain that everyone in the house was deep in sleep, I carefully packed a small bag with only the most essential items, a change of clothes, the few dollars I had managed to save, my mother's locket that had belonged to her mother before her, and the book of poetry that Jimmy had given me with his own poems written in the margins. I climbed out of my bedroom window for what I believed would be the last time, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain it would wake the entire neighborhood. Jimmy was waiting in the shadows beside his borrowed car, an old Ford that belonged to another teacher at the school who had agreed to help us without asking too many questions. We drove through the empty streets of Salem like fugitives escaping from prison, holding hands across the front seat and speaking in whispers, even though there was no one to overhear us. Every mile that passed between us and my father's house felt like a small victory, a step closer to the freedom we had dreamed about for months. We made it to Mill City just as the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed like a blessing on our desperate adventure. Jimmy's Aunt Martha lived in a tiny house at the edge of town, and she welcomed us with tears in her eyes and arms that wrapped around us both, like we were her own children, coming home after a long, dangerous journey. "You can stay here as long as you need," she promised, leading us up narrow stairs to a small attic room that would become our entire world for the next 3 months. Those 3 months in Mill City felt like the most beautiful dream I had ever lived, a perfect bubble of happiness that existed outside of time and consequences. Jimmy found work at the local lumber mill, coming home each evening covered in sawdust and smelling of pine, his hands rough but gentle when he held me close. I helped Aunt Martha with her sewing business, learning to create beautiful garments for the ladies in town who needed alterations or special occasion dresses. We lived simply in that tiny attic room, with nothing but a bed, a small table, 2 chairs, and a window that looked out over the mountains in the distance. But we had each other, and that felt like more wealth than all the money in my father's bank accounts could ever provide. Every morning I would wake up next to the man I loved and feel overwhelmed with gratitude for each stolen day we were given together. We talked about getting married properly as soon as we could save enough money for the ceremony and the train tickets to California. Jimmy wrote long letters to his cousin in Los Angeles, asking about work opportunities and places where we could start fresh without anyone knowing our history. I practiced signing my name as Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell in the margins of old newspapers, each signature feeling like a small act of rebellion against the life my father had tried to force upon me. We felt safe in our little hideaway, protected by Aunt Martha's fierce loyalty and the miles of distance between us and Salem's disapproving eyes. In the evenings, Jimmy would read his poetry to me by lamplight, his voice soft and musical, as he shared verses about love and hope and the dreams we were building together, one day at a time. We made plans for the house we would have in California, with a garden where I could grow vegetables and flowers, a front porch where we could sit in the evenings and watch our children play in the yard. Those children felt so real to us, even though they existed only in our imagination, and we would spend hours choosing names and discussing what we would teach them about courage and love and following their hearts no matter what the world might say. But in late August, our perfect dream began to show cracks that we tried desperately to ignore. I began feeling terribly sick in the mornings, a nausea so severe that I could barely keep down the breakfast that Aunt Martha prepared with such loving care. At first, I convinced myself it was just the stress of our situation, the emotional toll of living in hiding, while knowing that my father was probably searching for us with every resource at his disposal. But when the sickness continued for 2 weeks without any sign of improvement, Aunt Martha pulled me aside one afternoon while Jimmy was at work for a gentle but serious conversation. "Child," she said, her voice full of knowing compassion, "I've had 6 babies of my own, and I recognize the signs. I think you might be carrying a little one." The news should have filled me with pure joy, and part of me was absolutely thrilled at the thought of having Jimmy's baby, of creating a new life from the love we shared so deeply. But I was also terrified because I knew our secret couldn't stay hidden much longer, and a baby would make everything infinitely more complicated and dangerous. How could we travel to California with an infant? How could Jimmy support a family on the wages he might earn as a stranger in a new city? How could we explain a baby to people who might ask questions about marriage certificates and family histories? When I told Jimmy the news that evening, sitting on our narrow bed with tears streaming down my face, he held me close and promised that nothing would change, except that our love would grow even stronger. "We'll be a real family," he said, his own voice thick with emotion. "A real family built on love instead of arrangements and expectations." He kissed my forehead and spoke to my still flat stomach as if the baby could already hear his voice. "We're going to give you everything," he whispered. "Love and safety and all the freedom in the world to become whoever you're meant to be." But fate, as I was about to learn in the most devastating way possible, had entirely different plans for all of us. Someone in Mill City recognized me despite all our efforts to remain anonymous, and they sent word back to Salem about the Colonel's runaway daughter and her inappropriate companion. I never learned who betrayed us, but I've spent 70 years wondering if it was someone who genuinely believed they were helping my family find me, or someone who simply enjoyed being the bearer of scandalous news. On a cold September morning that started like any other, I woke up to the sound of multiple car doors slamming outside Aunt Martha's house with a violence that made the windows rattle. Through our small attic window, I could see my father's distinctive black Cadillac parked in the narrow driveway, along with 2 other cars filled with men I recognized as his business associates and political allies. My heart stopped completely as I watched my father emerge from the lead car, his face set in the expression of cold fury that had terrified me since childhood. He was dressed in his full military uniform despite being retired, as if he were leading a mission to recapture enemy territory rather than collecting his wayward daughter. Jimmy tried to hide me behind the old wardrobe, but there was nowhere to go in that tiny room. No escape route that wouldn't involve jumping from a 2nd-story window. We could hear heavy footsteps on the stairs, Aunt Martha's voice raised in protest, and my father's commands cutting through the morning air like knife blades. When Colonel William Thompson climbed those narrow stairs and saw us together in that intimate space, his face turned a color I had never seen before, a deep purple that spoke of blood pressure rising to dangerous levels and rage beyond anything I had imagined possible. "You have disgraced our family name for the last time," he said, his voice deadly quiet in the way that was somehow more frightening than shouting. But Jimmy, my brave and foolish and wonderful Jimmy, stepped directly in front of me, despite being outweighed by 40 pounds and facing a man who had commanded troops in 2 wars. "Colonel Thompson," he said, his voice steady despite the fear I could see in his eyes. "I love your daughter more than my own life, and she loves me. We want to get married and build a life together based on respect and genuine affection. Isn't that what any parent would want for their child?" I had never seen anyone stand up to my father with such quiet dignity, and for one impossible moment, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, the power of truth and love might actually reach whatever remained of his heart, beneath all that military discipline and social ambition. Instead, my father's face grew even darker, and I could see the veins standing out on his forehead like roads on a map leading to disaster. "You think you can steal my daughter and corrupt her virtue and get away with it?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the low ceiling of the attic room. "You think a poor school teacher with no family name and no prospects is worthy of a Thompson? You think love is more important than duty and honor and maintaining the standards that built this community?" The argument escalated quickly from there, with Jimmy defending our relationship with passionate eloquence, and my father threatening to have him arrested for kidnapping, moral corruption, and half a dozen other charges that probably wouldn't hold up in court, but could certainly ruin a young teacher's reputation forever. I stood frozen between these two men who represented completely different worlds, completely different values, completely different ideas about what my life should be. Jimmy spoke about love and choice and the right of two adults to determine their own destiny. My father spoke about duty and family honor and the responsibilities that come with being born into a position of privilege and respect in the community. They were fighting over my future, as if I were property to be claimed, rather than a human being with thoughts and feelings and dreams of my own. The confrontation might have continued for hours if not for what happened next, the moment that changed everything and sent my life spinning in a direction I never could have anticipated. Suddenly, in the middle of his furious speech about family obligations and social expectations, my father clutched his chest with both hands and made a sound I had never heard before, a gasping, choking noise that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside his body. His face went from purple to gray in a matter of seconds, and then he collapsed onto the floor of that tiny attic room with a crash that shook the entire house. The heart attack was massive and immediate, striking him down like lightning from a clear sky. Jimmy and I both rushed to his side, but there was nothing either of us could do except watch helplessly as the most powerful man I had ever known struggled for breath that wouldn't come. His eyes stayed fixed on my face during those final moments, and I saw something in them that I had never seen before. Not anger or disappointment, but what looked almost like regret, as if in those last seconds he was remembering the little girl who used to climb onto his lap and ask him to read her stories before bedtime. He died right there on the floor of Aunt Martha's attic, with his hand reaching toward me and his mouth forming words that never had the chance to become sound. I blamed myself completely and immediately for what had happened. In my 19-year-old mind, there was no question that my disobedience, my selfish pursuit of love over duty, my complete disregard for everything he had tried to teach me about family obligations, had literally killed my father. The guilt hit me like a physical blow, doubling me over with pain that had nothing to do with the baby growing inside me, and everything to do with the terrible certainty that I had committed the ultimate sin against the man who had given me life. Jimmy tried to comfort me, wrapping his arms around my shaking shoulders and whispering that it wasn't my fault, that my father's heart had probably been weak for years, that stress from his business dealings and political responsibilities could have caused the attack just as easily as finding us together. But I couldn't hear his reassurances through the roar of self-condemnation in my head. All I could think about was my father's face in those final moments, the way his eyes had looked at me with what might have been forgiveness, or might have been accusation, or might have been simple love that I had been too young and too stubborn to recognize before it was too late. My father's funeral 3 days later was the largest Salem had seen in more than a decade, with hundreds of people gathering to pay their respects to a man who had been a pillar of the community for 40 years. I stood at his graveside in a black dress borrowed from Aunt Martha, feeling like I was attending my own execution rather than a memorial service. Every person who approached me to offer condolences seemed to know about the scandal, about how Colonel Thompson's wild daughter had brought shame to the family name and caused his death through her selfish rebellion. My mother was inconsolable, weeping into a handkerchief that was already soaked through, and my younger sister Rebecca looked at me with such disappointment and accusation that I wanted to disappear into the earth beside my father's coffin. The whole town was buzzing with whispered conversations about the events that had led to this tragedy, and I could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on me like a physical force. Some people were sympathetic, understanding that a young woman might be confused about love and duty, but most seemed to agree that I had directly caused my father's death through my disobedience and lack of respect for family values. Jimmy attended the funeral despite my pleas for him to stay away, standing at the back of the crowd with his hat in his hands and tears streaming down his face. After the service, my Uncle Charles approached me with Sheriff Deputy Morrison at his side, their faces grim with purpose. "Eleanor," Uncle Charles said, his voice carrying none of the warmth I remembered from childhood visits. "You're coming home with us now. This situation has gone on long enough, and it's time for you to face your responsibilities to your family and your father's memory." They escorted me to their car while Jimmy watched helplessly from across the cemetery, knowing that any attempt to intervene would only make things worse for both of us. As we drove away, I turned to look back at him one last time, memorizing his face and promising myself that somehow, someday, we would find our way back to each other. I had no idea that it would be the last time I would ever see the love of my life. Back in my childhood home, I became essentially a prisoner, with my mother and Aunt Helen watching my every move and monitoring every conversation to make sure I didn't try to contact Jimmy or plan another escape. They took away my shoes so I couldn't walk anywhere, locked my bedroom door at night, and assigned different family members to accompany me whenever I left the house for any reason. The grief over my father's death combined with morning sickness from the pregnancy I was trying desperately to hide made every day feel like an endurance test that I wasn't sure I could pass. But the worst part was the growing secret inside me, the knowledge that I was carrying Jimmy's child, while everyone around me assumed I was simply dealing with guilt and sorrow over my father's death. By October, when I was 3 months pregnant, I couldn't hide the changes in my body anymore, despite wearing the loosest dresses I could find and avoiding meals whenever possible. When my mother finally confronted me about my condition, discovering the truth in the way that mothers always seem to know their daughters' secrets, she made a decision that would define the rest of my life and create a lie so enormous that it would shape 3 generations of our family. "We will tell everyone that your cousin Margaret, in Portland, died in childbirth and left us her baby to raise," she announced with the kind of cold efficiency she usually reserved for organizing church committees. "The child will be your brother, not your son. You will treat him as your brother for the rest of your life. No one can ever know the truth about his parentage because it would destroy what's left of our family's reputation and honor your father's memory with even more scandal." I was 19 years old, pregnant, emotionally devastated, and completely powerless to fight back against a decision that felt like another death sentence. The lie became our family's new reality before I even had time to fully understand what it would mean for the rest of my life. During the remaining months of my pregnancy, I lived in a strange limbo between anticipation and dread, excited about